care they need in the years to come. We think too of the police and first responders who ran into that scene of unspeakable horror. The courage they showed and the lives they saved is public service at its very best. Yesterday, Axel Rudakabana pled guilty to all charges. He stands responsible for one of the most barbaric crimes in our country's history, the most vile and cowardly attack on little children who could never defend themselves, carried out in the most horrific and traumatic way. The CPS has described him as a young man with a sickening and sustained interest in death and violence, who has shown no sign of remorse. On Thursday before sentencing, the prosecution will set out what happened that day and the nature of those offences. But, Mr. Speaker, now that the conviction has been secured, the families, the people of Southport and the entire country need answers about how this horrendous attack could ever have happened. The government has been constrained in what we could say up to this point about Rudakabana's past to avoid prejudicing any jury trial in line with all the normal rules of our British justice systems, because nothing was more important than securing justice. But now we can start to lay out that background. Multiple different agencies were in contact with Rudakabana and knew about his history of violence. He was referred 3 times to Prevent between December 2019 and April 2021, when aged 13 and 14. Between October 2019 and May 2022, Lancashire Police responded to 5 calls from his home address about his behaviour. He was referred repeatedly to the multi-agency safeguarding hub. He had contact with Children's Social Care, the Early Help Service, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. He was convicted of a violent assault against another child at school and was referred to the Youth Offending Team. He was excluded from one school. He had long periods of absence from another. All those agencies had contact with him. Yet between them, they completely failed to identify the terrible danger that he posed. How did he fall through so many gaps? It is just unbearable to think that something more could and should have been done. So there are grave questions about how this network of agencies failed to identify and act on the risks. There were so many signs of how dangerous he had become, yet the action against him was far too weak. So families need the truth about why the system failed to tackle his violence for so many years. That is why we are setting up an independent public inquiry. Like the Angelini inquiry into Wayne Couzens, it will begin work initially on a non-statutory basis so that it can move quickly into action, but with statutory powers added later as required. We will set out the terms of reference and appoint the chair once we have consulted the coroner and given the families the opportunity to comment. And in addition to examining what went wrong in this horrific case, I am also asking the inquiry to consider the wider challenge of rising youth violence and extremism. Because I have been deeply disturbed at the number of cases involving teenagers drawn into extremism, serious violence and terrorism, including Islamist extremism, far-right extremism, mixed and confused ideology, and the obsession with violence and gore. There has been a 3-fold increase in under-18s investigated for involvement in terrorism in just 3 years. 162 people were referred to Prevent last year for concerns relating to school massacres. The Met Commissioner has warned about young men who are fixated on violence grazing across extremist and terrorist content online. And Five Eyes counter-terror partners have warned about growing radicalization of minors, happening as so many of our children and teenagers are being exposed to ever more disturbing materials online, an online ecosystem that is radicalizing our children while safety measures are whittled away. The Online Safety Act illegal content codes of practice come into force in March, and the child safety codes should be in place this summer. But companies should take responsibility before then. The prosecution will provide more detail on Thursday about material Rudakabana searched for online, but I can tell the House the government is this week contacting technology companies to ask them to remove dangerous material that he accessed. Companies should not be profiting from hosting content that puts children's lives at risk. And let me set out 4 other areas where we're taking action in advance of the inquiry. Firstly, on Prevent. The government and counter-terrorism policing jointly commissioned an immediate Prevent learning review during the summer, and I will publish detailed findings following the sentencing. The 3 referrals took place between 3 and 4 years before the Southport attack, including following evidence that he was expressing interest in school shootings, in the London Bridge attack, the IRA, MI5 and the Middle East. On each occasion, Rudakabana's case was assessed by counter-terrorism policing, but in each case there was no onward referral to specialist channel support. The learning review has concluded the referrals should not have been closed, and that cases such as these, given his age and complex needs, should be referred to channel. It concludes that too much weight was placed on the absence of ideology without considering the vulnerabilities to radicalization or taking account of whether he was obsessed with massacre or extreme violence. And the cumulative significance of those 3 repeat referrals was not properly considered. Mr. Speaker, the Prevent programme is vital for our national security, and its officers work with huge dedication to keep us safe. But we need it to be effective. Some changes have already been made since 2021, including new Prevent duty guidance, new training for frontline workers on radicalisation, stronger policy on repeat referrals. And in September 2024, a new Prevent assessment framework was launched, supplemented by robust training for all Prevent police officers. But these changes do not go far enough. Given the importance of the programme, I cannot understand how it has been allowed to operate for so long without proper independent oversight. That is why I announced before Christmas the introduction of a new independent Prevent Commissioner with the power to review cases and to ensure that standards are being met. So I'm today appointing Lord David Anderson, KC, as an interim Prevent Commissioner to start work immediately, and his first task will be to conduct a thorough review of the Prevent history in this case to identify what changes are needed to make sure serious cases are not missed, particularly where there is mixed and unclear ideology. I've also tasked my department to conduct an end-to-end review of Prevent thresholds, including on Islamist extremism, where referrals have previously been too low. And we're looking at cases where mental ill health or neurodivergence is a factor and developing new arrangements with other agencies which may not meet the threshold for channel counter-extremism support, but where violent behaviour urgently must be addressed. Second, 2 shocking facts around knife crime emerged from this case. The Prevent Learning Review found that Rudakabana admitted to having carried a knife more than 10 times, yet the action against him was far too weak. And despite the fact that he'd been convicted for violence and was just 17, he was easily able to order a knife on Amazon. That's a total disgrace, and it must change. So we will bring in stronger measures to tackle knife sales online in the Crime and Policing Bill this spring. Mr. Speaker, thirdly, as the Prime Minister has set out this morning, we need to ensure our laws keep up with the changing violent and extremist threats we face. It is for the police and CPS to decide whether individual cases meet the definitions set out in the Terrorism Act 2000 when making charges. But given the growing number of cases where perpetrators are seeking to terrorise, even without a clear ideology, we need to ensure the law, powers and sentencing are strong enough to cope. I have therefore asked the independent reviewer on terrorism powers to examine the legislation in this area in the light of the modern threats we face. Finally, Mr. Speaker, let me address the issues of contempt of court. Because the British way of justice means information is presented to the court by the police and CPS with restrictions on what can be said beforehand, so the jury does not get partial or prejudicial information in advance to make sure that the trial is fair and justice is done. Social media puts those long-established rules under strain, especially where partial and inaccurate information appears online, and the Law Commission is reviewing the contempt of court rules in that light. But let me be clear, where the police, government and journalists are given clear advice from the CPS about contempt of court and about not publishing information in advance of a trial, if we did not respect that and a killer walked free, we would never be forgiven. Mr. Speaker, there are times when something so unfathomably terrible happens that whatever words we find feel grossly insufficient. And that is how it feels over the Southport attack. So let there be no doubt. Responsibility for this outrage lies squarely with the perpetrator, but equally, in the wake of such a monstrous atrocity, we have to ask every question, no matter how difficult, and where change is needed, we must act. That is now our task. We owe that to the victims, to their loved ones, and we owe it to the country, because protecting the public is the first duty of the government and the shared purpose of this House. I commend this statement to the House.
Right, let us start and we'll get everybody in who was there on time. Can I come now to the Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Philp?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement and for the briefing which she very kindly arranged. Firstly, let us remember the 3 young, innocent victims of this savage and senseless attack. BB King was just 6 years old, Elsie Dot Stankham was 7, and Alice da Silva Aguiar 9 years old. Their lives were cruelly cut short as they attended a Taylor Swift dance class. It should have been a time of joy, part of a precious and innocent childhood, to be cherished and remembered. And yet, the darkest of shadows fell over Southport that day as these girls were robbed of their young lives. Let us not forget that 8 more children and 2 adults were seriously injured on that day as well. Many of us in this House are parents or grandparents, and many people listening will be as well. We can only begin to imagine the pain and grief the parents and family of baby Elsie and Alice must now be feeling. And of course, we should recognise and thank the first responders who arrived on the scene. So, Mr. Speaker, we owe it to the memory of those children and to their bereaved parents to learn the lessons from this terrible incident and to take steps to make sure it doesn't happen again. And so, in that spirit, I welcome and support the inquiry announced yesterday. I asked the Home Secretary to confirm that it will be placed on a statutory footing as soon as possible to ensure its independence and also to enable it to compel disclosure of the evidence which it may need. It is vital to get to the truth about what opportunities may have existed to stop the evil perpetrator, Axel Radicabana, from committing these sickening murders. Radicabana was encountered multiple times, as the Home Secretary said, by the police, social services, the school system and the Prevent programme over a period of several years. The inquiry will find out, I hope, whether mistakes were made or whether the law needs to change. And the Home Secretary mentioned some areas that will rightly be looked at, and I support that. I hope the Home Secretary can also confirm this will include consideration of whether the Mental Health Act was adequate for this case. The Home Secretary has also rightly referred to Prevent. A review of Prevent was conducted by William Shawcross, and the last government responded in February 2024. Will the Home Secretary now commit to implementing all of the recommendations of the Shawcross review? Let me now turn to what happened after the murders and to the importance of openness and transparency. Firstly, and this is a very serious and important question, will the Home Secretary confirm that the inquiry will also cover the government, police and CPS response to the murders and especially the handling of public communications and the appalling riots that followed? It's a very important question. I would be grateful if the Home Secretary would directly answer that in her response. Now, the Prime Minister this morning acknowledged that he knew about the background to the case and to Radicalization himself, including the fact that he had been referred to Prevent on 3 separate occasions, and that Radicalization had been found to be in possession of ricin, a highly toxic chemical, and a manual detailing al-Qaeda terrorist methods, itself an offence under the Terrorism Act. The Prime Minister also said this morning that he did not disclose any of this to the public in the days and weeks after the murders for fear of prejudicing the subsequent murder trial. And it is, of course, important for journalists and for politicians, and indeed this House, to do nothing that might prejudice a trial. But David Hall, KC, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, said this on the Today programme in the context of this case in October, and it bears quoting in full. Jonathan Hall said this: "The government has to be aware that if there is an information gap, then other voices, particularly on social media, will fill that gap." He went on, "If there is any information you can give, put it in the public domain, and be really careful you don't fall into the trap of saying, we can say zilch because there are criminal proceedings. Quite often," he said, "there is a fair amount that can be put into the public domain." Jonathan Hall concluded by saying, "The police now realise that just saying there is a charge, we can't say any more, is not going to cut it these days." So the independent reviewer is saying that the government and police can put some material into the public domain without prejudicing subsequent trials. And in fact, on October the 29th, Radicalization was charged with possessing the ricin and the terror manual. That was then made public. So if it can be made public in October without risking prejudice of the murder trial, it follows that it could have been made public in August without prejudicing that same trial. Background facts on other cases over the years have been made public after arrest and before trial without prejudice, and the shields relating to 2 of those cases are in this chamber. So why did the Prime Minister not make public some of this background information in August when he knew it, when later disclosure of that information in October demonstrated such disclosure could be made without prejudice? And why did the Deputy Prime Minister on July the 31st dismiss as, and I quote, "fake news" those saying there may be further facts to come out? Let me just briefly, Mr. Speaker, before concluding, explain why this is important. As Jonathan Hall said, if there is a void, then misinformation, especially online, can fill that void. And this appears to be what happened here. And some of that information, it is said, originated overseas from hostile states. It is possible, indeed it is even likely, that this misinformation that was put into the void fuelled the totally unacceptable riots we then subsequently saw. So, will the Home Secretary accept, given what I've just said and what Jonathan Hall said, does she accept there should and could have been more openness and transparency, as I just set out, without prejudicing the trial, and that disclosing more of that truth openly and transparently would have helped combat the damaging misinformation that circulated and which arguably fuelled the riots? Will she confirm the inquiry will look at that aspect of events? Mr. Speaker, this was an appalling tragedy. Young girls murdered with their whole lives ahead of them. Let us all learn the lessons from this tragedy in honour of their memory.
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Shadow Home Secretary raised a series of points, which is obviously a substantial shift in position for him and his party from the position they have taken in government. He asked about whether the status of the inquiry. I can confirm it's going to start quickly on a non-statutory basis in the same way that the Angelini inquiry did, but I can confirm it will be given whatever powers it needs, including on a statutory basis, so that it can get any information that it needs. He referred to the Shawcross review. I can confirm that the government has implemented 33 out of the 34 recommendations, but I would just gently point out to him that actually the approach that the Shawcross review took was to say that the Prevent programme should be narrowed and should actually just focus particularly on the cases around terrorism, and in fact could have put at risk, actually including less cases like this where ideology is less clear. He then raises the issue about the information that was provided, and he will know that the Contempt of Court Act was set out in 1981. The Jonathan Hall has indeed highlighted the problem of disinformation online, social media actors who are not bound by the same rules that the police, the media and the government follow. And he refers, for example, to the name and the nationality being provided, which in practice they were in this case, after misinformation appeared online. But ultimately, he has also said all of this is governed by the Contempt of Court Act 1981, and the Law Commission is reviewing that. But it is not for the government to ignore the law or the advice that we are given when justice for families is at stake. And let me point out to him that the previous Conservative government did not publish information before the trial about the Prevent referral for the perpetrator who killed Sir David Amis. None of us criticised them for that because none of us wanted to put at risk justice for Sir David's family, nor did they publish information before the trial on the Prevent referral of the asylum seeker who killed Tom Roberts. In fact, they didn't even publish that after the trial. It only came out in the inquest. And the minister, who even after the trial refused to answer my questions on whether they knew that he was wanted for murdering 2 people in Serbia when he was allowed to enter the country, was the current Shadow Justice Secretary. Now, we have been keen to publish the information on Prevent referrals from the start, but throughout, the advice to us has been clear. And if we had ignored the advice that we were given from about the case that put towards us and about the information that the police and the CPS were working through in order to get justice, and if as a result a killer had walked free, no one would ever have forgiven the government or anyone else. The most important thing is to get justice, and then once justice is secured, to make sure at this point the questions are answered about what went wrong and why 3 young girls' lives were lost. That is the question he should be focusing on right now.
Patrick Hurley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been another tough week for my Southport constituency, I'm sure members across the House will appreciate. I'd like to start by thanking the Home Secretary and also the Prime Minister for the calm, diligent way in which they've undertook their work over the last 6 months, and for the way in which they've been good friends to Southport. I was clear back in the summer that I did not want people speculating online as to the motives or the background of the person that we can now say was the murderer of those 3 girls. We were risking the trial would be prejudiced. The trial could have collapsed because of that speculation, because of what wasn't just speculation, but also in some respects downright lies. And downright lies that were being circulated in the interests of gaining political gain for themselves, with the interests of justice a distant second. So in the same vein, will the Home Secretary agree with me that the next stage of achieving justice for my community and the families impacted so desperately by the crime back in July, the public inquiry, should also be allowed to undertake its work and make its recommendations free of the ridiculous nonsense and lies that we've seen from public figures who should know better, circulating purely for their own interests?
Secretary.
My honourable friend has been a really important voice for his community throughout this unimaginably difficult time and has spoken for them with great dignity and passion, including in this House. He is right that nothing should be done. It is part of our British justice traditions that information is produced at the trial, but not in advance for fear of prejudicing a jury and then for undermining justice and potentially letting criminals walk free. And he is right that we should never do that, but he's also right that his community, the people across Southport, particularly the families involved, need now to get answers. And the answers that they need about how on earth this shocking and disturbing barbaric attack could have been able to happen. What went wrong, what could have been done to prevent it, but also how we as a society face up to the rising youth violence and extremism that we have seen, this being just one example of some very disturbing cases. That is the justice and the answers those families need.
Come to Liberal Democrat spokesperson Lisa Smart.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very grateful to the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement. What happened in Southport last year was a horrific tragedy. 3 innocent young girls, Alice, Bibi and Elsie, lost their lives to an act of senseless, brutal violence, and our thoughts go out to the bereaved families and their friends for whom this week will be incredibly difficult. We all owe it to these girls to ensure that a senseless tragedy like this can never happen again. It has been deeply concerning to hear reports about how, in the lead-up to the attack, warning signs were missed as the attacker fell through the cracks of the system. So the Liberal Democrats welcome the government's commitment to an inquiry, and there are clearly tough questions that need to be asked. The inquiry must not shy away from getting those answers. Of course, this inquiry, like others, will only reach its full potential when there is a duty of candor that requires public officials and authorities to cooperate fully. And so I'd welcome more details from the Home Secretary on when her government plans to finally introduce the Hillsborough Law to Parliament. Our country also deserves a counter-terrorism strategy that keeps our communities safe and is fit to tackle the modern challenges we face in an increasingly complex online world crossing international boundaries. So will the Home Secretary confirm that these concerns will be addressed in the upcoming counter-terrorism strategy? This must be a watershed moment where we move forwards by building a system that avoids future failures like we've seen in this case. And it is my sincere hope that we can work together across this House to make this a reality.
Home Secretary.
Well, the honourable member makes an important point. The duty of candour is something that we want to introduce as part of the Hillsborough Law. She's also right to talk about the challenges in terms of countering terrorism, countering extremism, and also these changing patterns we've seen of extreme violence, the kind of thing that the Met Commissioner has described, where those with a fixation on violence and gore are also consuming different bits of terrorist material and extremist material as well. The ideology may be unclear, but they pose a danger to the public. And what this inquiry needs to look at is all of those issues, but we also need, as part of the prevent work we are doing and the countering terrorism work we are doing, to make pace in these areas as well.
Lawrence Esher-Lobby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the Home Secretary for her statement this afternoon. And as many right honourable members have said, our thoughts remain with Bibi, Elsie and Alice. And we can all remember where we were that late mid-morning on the 29th of July. I just dropped my 2 children at their holiday camp at school. And when the news broke, that panic, and when you almost stop for a minute to think, are my children safe? And we think about the other children and the trauma that they will be feeling. And the first responders who ran towards that danger, knowing that they could have been harmed. And the Home Secretary has announced an inquiry, but we've seen that sadly, the issues of young children as young as 16, 15, what they are viewing online and the nature of the violence the nature of the violence that was used on Eliane Andon when she was tragically stabbed in Croydon on the 27th of September, the nature of the violence that Alex Rudikani used on these 3 girls. How would the Secretary of State ensure, the Home Secretary ensure, that the institutions which, if we're honest, have failed to see those warning signs will not fail in the future? What would the inquiry do differently so that we are not finding ourselves as a House coming back to recount dangerous tragedies again in the future?
My honourable friend is right to describe how every parent, every grandparent will have felt on hearing those awful descriptions that on that day in July. And also right to focus on what it is our young people, our children, are seeing online. And if we don't face up to this, the damage that we could be doing through generations is really disturbing and troubling. But that means that social media companies need to take responsibility. The Online Safety Act will bring stronger codes and requirements in, but they also need to take some responsibility instead of going backwards, which they are at the moment.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Karen Bradley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Home Secretary's statement, and my thoughts are with everybody involved. The list that she set out of the points of the agencies and institutions that could have intervened sooner is truly terrifying. So what reassurance can she give the House that this is a cross-government piece of work and that all agencies and institutions will be involved? And as and when the inquiry makes recommendations, which it will do hopefully on an interim basis, will she give some commitment that she will look carefully at them and implement them as soon as possible?
Home Secretary.
Certainly, of course, look at any recommendations that come from this inquiry because it is so important. We need it to look both at what went wrong in this case, and it's particularly about the interactions between different agencies. There were so many agencies involved, but as a network, they just failed both to identify the risk and to have sufficient action in place. Lancashire County Council have done a initial rapid review, and there has to be a statutory child safeguarding practice review, and of course there also has to be a coroner's inquiry as well. However, our view is exactly that. These are not sufficient because of that cross-agency examination you need to do about all of the things that have gone wrong in this case. We have to start from the dangers that were posed in Southport to those children in such a devastating way, and then see why did the system so badly fail to protect children against those dangers, rather than just every organisation working in its own silo and only doing their bit and then leaving children at risk.
Bill Esterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for her statement and for announcing the setting up of the public inquiry. I want to remember Alice, Bibi and Elsie, their families and friends. I also want to remember the other victims of the attack and the first responders, some of whom have told me over the last 6 months their harrowing accounts of what they found at the Herts base in Southport. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that we in this House should recommit to the principle nothing we say or do in this place or elsewhere could prejudice criminal proceedings or prevent justice being secured? Does she agree that to have done so in this case would have been an insult to the memories of Alice, Bibi and Elsie, an insult to their families and friends, and an insult to everyone in the community in Southport who were and remain so badly affected by what happened on the 29th of July last year?
Home Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend makes a really important point, because the families and all the people of Southport, the people across the country, need truth, need answers about what happened and about what went so badly wrong in this case. And that is why the information is put before the trial. That is why the information is released after the trial. That is how the British justice system works. But crucially, at the heart of this, they have to have justice. There has to be an account for such a terrible, terrible, barbaric crime. And we, all of us, have to make sure that that justice is delivered, and rightly, because when lives have been lost in such a terrible way, justice is the minimum they deserve.
Sir David Davis.
I hope the Home Secretary will not take it as a discourtesy if I say to her that actually it should be the Prime Minister making this statement here today. I say that because this morning he said on television that singleton terrorist attacks were a very new occurrence. They're not. They've been going on for nearly a decade, many in London, one in the yard of this House of Commons, and of course one killed Sir David Amess, our colleague. And in that attack on Sir David Amess, the police declared it a terrorist incident the same day, without 3 prevent references, without Rioting, without an Al-Qaeda manual. They declared it a terrorist event the same day. So we all wonder why this was not the case here, when there was such evidence. This is a clear mistake, is it not?
Home Secretary.
So the decision about the application of the Terrorism Act 2000 is one for the police and ultimately the CPS when they lay charges based on the operational information that they have. The prosecution will lay out more information that they put before sentencing that they would have put before the court on Tuesday had the information today. So we'd had the offender not pleaded guilty initially, and that is for them to decide. But the point the Prime Minister made this morning was that this was clearly a case where someone attempted to terrorise the community. That was clearly his intention, to kill those children and also to terrorise more widely. And that is why we have to ensure that even where there are cases where the police or the prosecution say they have not been able to prove ideology, that we still have the right powers, the right sentencing, the right ability to respond with swiftness and seriousness to the kinds of cases we face. And that is why he has said that this needs to be reviewed. I referred to the independent reviewer of terrorism, powers looking at these issues. And it's also why we have this statement to the House and are making this inquiry, because where I would disagree with him when he said, well, we've had these cases for a long time, the thing we've seen in very recent years is this really big increase in youth violence and extremism on a really disturbing scale. And I do think that needs to be part of the inquiry as well.
Sean Davis.
Can I associate myself and my community with a statement from the Home Secretary on this tragic incident? Whether it be purchasing knives online or whether it be the sharing of these horrible videos celebrating violence and death, there's clearly a gap between the ability of the state to hold social media companies to account and also online retailers. What more can the government do, together with the intelligence services, to take robust action and hold to account these companies that are allowing this extremism, this violence, this horror to be present on their social media companies?
Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend raises a really important point. We are raising with the companies some of the particular dangerous material that this terrible offender accessed online, and the police and prosecution will say more about some of that material later this week. But he's also right to highlight the issue around online knife sales, because we know from the case of Ronan Candor, who was so brutally murdered by a ninja sword, where the perpetrator was able to get that, just buy it online, just pick it up with no age checks at all. And in this case, for a 17-year-old to be able to just get the knife that he was able to use online from Amazon, that is just frankly shocking. Commander Stephen Clayman has been doing a review for us on online knife sales and on the kinds of checks that should be taking place, and we will, based on that review, be bringing forward new measures to tackle this problem.
James Cleverly.
I'm particularly drawn to the line in the immediate learning review that it concludes that too much weight was placed on the absence of ideology without considering the vulnerabilities to radicalisation. I mean, the fact is, much of the challenge over the summer is because there was an understandable lack of public understanding of the distinction between a terrorist incident and a non-terrorist incident. Had this person done exactly the same thing, but was driven by a desire to create a caliphate here in the UK, this would, of course, be defined as a terrorist attack. The fact it didn't is of no solace to those families who have lost loved ones. Is it now not the time? And I appreciate this could be part of the review, but I would urge her to make sure this is a particular emphasis to the review, to get rid of this entirely arbitrary distinction with motivation and focus exclusively on the risk and the actions.
Home Secretary.
Well, I think the right honourable member, the former Home Secretary, makes an extremely important point here, because from the point of view of families, from the point of view of the community, this was an attack that was intended to terrorise the community, and also from the point of view of families, the real concern is about the scale of harm that they've seen, the loss of children's lives and the impact on that community as well. The law is set out in the Terrorism Act 2000, and there is also a serious consideration for different agencies about the nature of the response. So if you have an ideological attack or a motivation, then it may be that the kind of countering extremism response, the kind of support that the Channel programme provides, might be targeted in one particular way if it is around an extremist ideology that needs to be challenged and tackled and taken down, or alternatively, if the issue is around mental health or the issue is around obsession with violence and gore, those may need different kinds of response. But he is right that the threats, from the point of view of the community, will feel the same. That's why the law needs to be looked at again, but it's also why we need to have this inquiry that can look at where the gaps are in the way in which different state agencies respond, because we've seen those growing gaps, and we've seen, obviously, those gaps in the most traumatic of ways in this case.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the statement the Home Secretary has made today? And in her statement and in the Prime Minister's speech this morning, they have painted a terrifying picture of how terrorism is changing in this country and the threat that we face is evolving, especially with the proliferation of extremely violent online content, and which is having an effect on mixed ideologies and from ideologies across the spectrum. Clearly, part of the response to this is going to be the response of the intelligence services. So can the Home Secretary tell us about how the intelligence services will be responding to this evolving threat and what the government is doing to prevent this growth of extremism through extreme online content?
Home Secretary.
Well, he's right that what we seem to have is cases where there is extreme violence or obsession grows around extreme violence, and then you have young people who then may cast around to maybe consuming different kinds of terrorist material or extremist material, but at its heart may be an obsession with violence as well. So different circumstances then require different kinds of response, but actually the scale of the growing obsession with violence should be a serious concern to us, because you do think, what are we allowing to happen to our kids and to our teenagers if we've seen this kind of obsession grow? And that's why we need action. Clearly, the focus of the intelligence and security agencies is around those cases where particularly there is organised ideology and radicalisation, as well as state threats. But we have to deal with the kinds of threats that our society faces much more widely, and that means everyone needs to be part of it.
Gethin's.
Can I associate myself with the remarks of colleagues about the murder of these 3 wee girls, the bravery of the first responders, but most of all we think about the families of those left behind. Can I also agree that the way in which we talk about these kind of cases, we have a responsibility to the victims to make sure we do so responsibly while keeping the government under scrutiny? There is a fast evolving situation in terms of technology companies. Can the Home Secretary tell us what areas she's looking at in terms of enforcement, but can she also tell me that it's a multi-agency, very diverse case? What interaction is she having with the Scottish Government and the devolved administrations in the areas where they have responsibility? Thank you.
Home Secretary.
Well, the honourable member is right that there are issues around the
the responsibility of social media companies, and the stronger powers will obviously be brought in as part of the Online Safety Act, but we are urging the companies to take responsibility now and not to continue to profit from really dangerous material that is putting kids at risk. In terms of the discussions with the Scottish Government, we actually have broad discussions planned for later this week around some of our shared Home Office responsibilities, and he will know, obviously, policing issues and crime issues are devolved, but national security issues where terrorism cases may fall or have an impact are also reserved matters as well. And so on these kinds of cases, we would expect to obviously consult and to discuss with the Scottish Government what the way forward is.
Paul Barker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for her statement, and my thoughts and prayers are with everyone involved. Acts of terror devastate the family of victims who are left to pick up the pieces, having their closest loved ones robbed of them in the cruelest way. As with the Forbury Gardens terrorist attack in 2020, which saw my constituents, Gary and Jan Fairlong, lose their beloved son James, these acts often take place after multiple agency failings. The Forbury Gardens perpetrator had been referred to Prevent 4 times and was known to mental health services. It will be important to those families in Southport that lessons are learned and acted upon in a timely way. So will the government engage with me and Survivors Against Terror over their calls for a Survivors Charter which would expand rights to survivors and the families of victims?
Home Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point, and the Security Minister has met with and had regular discussions with the survivors of terror, because the concerns they raise are very serious about the way in which survivors, for example, of the Manchester Arena attack ended up feeling badly let down, and the additional support that can be needed in these cases. So we will continue to discuss with those organisations about the support that's needed.
Sir Julian.
I trust that the Home Secretary agrees with me that the courage shown by the dance teacher and the member of the public who intervened should appropriately be recognised. But what troubles me is that we seem to have a subtext here of saying that if only this particular ticking time bomb had been successfully referred to Prevent, that could have stopped him doing what he did. Will the Home Secretary share with the House what measures are in place, assuming that someone so committed to fanaticism would not respond to Prevent? What measures are in place to keep the terrible events from happening? Do TPIMs, for example, apply in a case like that?
Home Secretary.
I think the honourable member makes a really important point here, because those referrals as well were 3 to 4 years before the attack, and multiple different agencies had contact with him. But there is a huge question about what powers, what interventions are available in a case where, even had they sufficiently identified the scale of risk and dangers he poses, what could be done? That is one of the reasons why the government is determined to bring in a new power, a youth diversion order, to be able to address some of the really difficult cases, particularly around teenagers, to look at what requirements might be put on young people in these cases, and we will bring forward legislation as part of the Crime and Policing Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The barbaric murder of those 3 little girls in Southport is part of a growing problem of youngsters fixated on violence and gore, as the Home Secretary has said. Though this worrying phenomenon has been fuelled by the rapid growth of websites and social media forums which promote and revel in that violence. So can the Home Secretary confirm that the inquiry into Southport will look into exactly this danger promoted by those websites?
Home Secretary.
We will certainly make sure that this issue is clearly in the scope of the inquiry. We need the inquiry to look at why we have so many more young people getting drawn into obsession with violence, extremist activity, and what exactly is going wrong and why, so that we can make sure that across society we take the action that is needed to keep our children safe.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Secretary has told us that last year alone 162 people have been referred to Prevent over concerns relating to school massacres. a truly shocking and disturbing figure. So could the Home Secretary please tell us how many of these people are currently in detention?
Home Secretary.
Well, he will know that the referral to prevent can be for young people who may have expressed an interest in school massacre, as opposed to those who have yet committed a crime. But the point of the Prevent programme is to try and get early intervention to take action to prevent young people committing crime. My view is that the powers are currently not strong enough to prevent young people committing crimes or getting drawn into this extremist violence, and that is exactly why we need to introduce the youth diversion order. That is a stronger power for the police to be able to take action in these extremely serious cases.
Mike Tapp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's important to note that this attacker is a terrorist. He's been charged under the Terrorism Act and the Biological Weapons Act. The man is a terrorist, Mr. Speaker. The attack itself has not been labelled as terrorism due to the lack of a clear ideological motive, a decision for the police and the CPS. Will the Home Office look into how our legal frameworks can be updated to recognise the full horror of acts intended to terrorise?
Home Secretary.
My old friend is right, we do need to ensure that the legal framework is up to date to make sure that there is the scope and the powers and the sentencing, frankly, as well, to ensure that where there are acts intended to terrorise, even where there is no ideology, that there are sufficient powers in place to be able to deal with this. And he is also right to say that because this man has been charged under the Terrorism Act and has pleaded guilty to a terrorist offence, I can confirm he will be treated as a terrorist offender in prison as well.
Dr. Andrew Murison.
Madam Deputy Speaker, if the authorities remain silent, then bad people will write the script. On the 16th of October 2021, those authorities and then their political masters were frank about what had happened the previous day in Southend, and there were no riots. Why is that different to this?
Home Secretary.
Well, I would say to the honourable member, in the case that he refers to, the attack on Sir David Amis, who I regard as a friend, and I know he does as well, was a great loss to this House, the government did not publish crucial information, for example, around the Prevent referral that had taken place. There was a lot of information that was not provided until the trial, and in fact this government is going further in providing information after the trial than was provided in that case as well. And I also don't think that anyone should attempt to excuse people who threw bricks and rocks at police officers as being somehow something to do with what information that they were provided and when. They committed crimes, they need to take responsibility for those crimes as well.
Gregor Poynton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've heard from Merseyside Police, the CPS and Counter-Terrorism Police about the wide range of violent content that the accused was accessing. That included a genocide and also social media searches for violent, fatal stabbings. Now, I know the Home Secretary has covered some of this in her statement and previous questions, but can I ask her what more should the social media and search engine giants be doing? Firstly, to stopping our young people accessing this content in the first place, and secondly, once they're being made aware of it, taking it down quickly from their sites.
So I think that my friend makes a really important point, because the thing about the social media companies is they have incredibly sophisticated technology and resources. These are the social media companies that know exactly how to target every single one of us on things that we might be interested online, and to use their algorithms in all kinds of sophisticated ways. They have the capability to do far more to identify this dangerous content and to take action on it. And I do believe that they should use those responsibilities rather than rowing back from content moderation, rather than reducing the responsible action that they need to take.
Saoirse Eastwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Home Secretary for your statement today, and indeed constituents across Lagan Valley are sending their thoughts and prayers to not just the families of Elsie, Alice and Baby, but indeed the community of Southport. Something that has deeply concerned me for a long time is indeed this radicalisation, particularly of young people, and you have explicitly stated that in your statement today, that it is an online surge of young people becoming radicalised, also including young people that are interested and looking at particular violent content against women and other sorts of terror linked. I would want to understand how the Home Secretary sees the lack of an ideology being captured in a way that it means that we can actually identify these potential perpetrators, and also in terms of actually the laws that we can make in this House to stop social media companies not only profiting but actually being aware of this violent and terrorist content that is online.
The honourable member is right to raise this. The director of NI5 has talked about how the security services are seeing far too many cases with very young people being drawn into poisonous online extremism, and 13% of all of those investigated for involvement in UK terrorism now under 18. That is a disturbing fact for all of us. She's right too that this needs to look at the complexity of, there are some young people who become radicalised around an ideology early on. There are others who become obsessed with violence. There are others who may switch between different extreme ideas and perspectives. But the point is that all of them are at risk of becoming dangerous to communities if they get drawn down this extremist track and their ideas get poisoned in this way by things that they see online. That is why it's so important, and that's why it's a central part of the inquiry.
Josh Simons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary for updating the House and welcome the uncompromising inquiry that she and the Prime Minister have announced. I'd also like to ask about social media and the digital information environment. I used to work in a technology company for a long period of time, and I totally concur with the Home Secretary's comments. They know what's circulating online. They know what's getting virality. So I'd like to ask the Home Secretary whether, after the summer, she feels that she and the Prime Minister have the information that they need in order to make decisions in real time to secure our information online environment.
Home Secretary.
So, the honourable member makes an important point. I don't think that anyone would suggest that in the end, ministers are in a position to make decisions on individual cases. What we need is the right kind of framework in place. Clearly, the Online Safety Act will put new structures and systems in place. The Prime Minister has made clear this morning that we should not shy away from taking any further action that is needed in order to address this, because fundamentally, if this is impacting on the safety of our children, we do need to act.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister's denial in August that Rudy Cabana was being investigated for offences under the Terrorism Act didn't protect the trial, because we found out these facts anyway when Rudy Cabana was charged in October. And the same disclosure didn't cause other trials, such as that of the Parsons Green tube bomber, to fail before. I'm not talking about the details of prevent referrals, which the Home Secretary has used in answers to similar questions, but of the information that was disclosed in October. If a jury knew that before the trial, why couldn't the Prime Minister have told the country the truth in August?
Home Secretary.
Well, the honourable member will know that the investigation is carried out by the police. The Crown Prosecution Service decide what charges to lay, and also decide, based on the evidence that they have gathered, how and when those charges should be laid. That is the British justice system that we have. It is the decisions made by police, it's decisions made by the prosecutors. They are rightly independent of ministers, and to be honest, I strongly believe, as part of our British judicial tradition, that independence must continue.
Conor Naismith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. From everything we have heard so far, the murderer in Southport was someone with a history of violence and a fascination with violence and someone who was just 17 years old at the time of this horrific attack. There are no circumstances in which he should have been able to buy a knife himself. So will the Home Secretary agree with me that we have to get to the bottom of how that deadly weapon was able to end up in his hands and ensure that teenagers are unable to buy these kinds of weapons in the future?
Home Secretary.
My honourable friend is right. Here, the perpetrator should never have been able to buy a knife online, and it is really disturbing that it is still far too easy, despite all of the cases that we've seen in the past, it is still far too easy for young people to be able to get access to knives online. That is why we will take action as part of the crime and policing bill, including taking action on online executives so that they take responsibility for the kinds of checks that need to take place.
Shockout Adam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for her statement. 3 referrals to prevent, 5 referrals to the local police force, multiple referrals to multiple hubs. Yet we still didn't protect Elsie, Alice and Bibi. We have failed them. We must ensure this never happens again. Would the Minister agree that whoever is the perpetrator, the victims are always terrorised? And does she agree that obsession with ideology may have been an underlying factor why we miss this perpetrator, and we need to relook at the Shawcross recommendations of ideology obsession?
Secretary.
Well, he's right that the Prevent Learning Review did identify that in this particular case, the focus on ideology may have meant that some of the vulnerabilities to radicalisation were missed. We also have to recognise that depending on the individual case, where there is ideology, that is different from cases where there is not and may require a different kind of response. So the assessment of risk, the assessment of the danger a young person poses may need to be the same, but the kind of response that the action that the state needs to take, depending on what is driving that action and that danger and that risk, needs to change. But for too long, some of those mixed ideology cases, some of those unclear cases may have been being missed because we haven't had sufficient focus on them. That's what the inquiry needs to do.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for her statement today. And of course the victims and all those affected are very much in our thoughts and prayers. And I think it's important that nothing that we say detracts from the sole responsibility of the perpetrator for these awful crimes. But it's right that we look into the situations beforehand. And I note that the Home Secretary has mentioned a few times multiple agency involvement and warnings. And I think for me that's one of the most concerning and shocking things. How come so many agencies were aware and raised concerns? This wasn't a lone wolf that popped out of nowhere. Who does she think ultimately bears responsibility for managing this perpetrator's risk?
Home Secretary.
The honourable member's question gets to the heart of the problem. So he's right that the responsibility for this appalling and barbaric attack lies with the attacker himself. He needs to face the consequences. It is the most heinous crime that he has committed. But we also have to ask those questions on behalf of the families about why so many agencies, there should have been a network of responsible agencies, in the end together failed to identify the scale of risk and to take the scale of action that was needed in this case. That is what the inquiry needs to look at, and I think part of the challenge is that it can be too easy for each agency to think that somebody else is addressing this bit of the problem, when actually there needs to be a much stronger approach between agencies. That's what the inquiry must look at.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think the vast majority of the British people agree with the government's own independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, who said repeatedly that in these serious incidents, these horrific crimes, more information needs to be put out sooner to avoid an information vacuum. But that's in conflict, of course, with the need to prevent prejudicing a fair trial. And therefore, does the Home Secretary agree with me that it's incumbent upon us in this House to find a way to overcome and reduce that conflict so we get more information sooner?
Home Secretary.
Well, the honourable member raises the issue about, particularly in a world of social media where there can be all sorts of information online and therefore there could be different kinds of information available, and yet, as he rightly says, we have to make sure that justice is done. We have to make sure that a jury is not prejudiced by information so that a killer can walk free, but we also have to make sure that people can get answers, people can get the crucial information that they need. The Law Commission is reviewing the Contempt of Court Act. That dates back to 1981, but I know he would recognise the importance of us following the law in the meantime and recognising the way we need to make sure that justice is done. And now that we have a verdict, making sure that the families can get proper answers, can find out what went wrong in this case, get the answers that they so badly need and deserve.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Well done, Home Secretary, on the proposals you're bringing forward. You have my full support in turning over every stone to look into the cases, and I fully, wholeheartedly agree with all the powers you're bringing forward. However, that is half of the story. The Home Secretary rightly talks about the balancing of possibly a criminal maybe walking free, but the actual nature of having riots up and down this country that happened. So will she consider conducting a review on creating a framework about how government talks about these issues so that it's standardised with the media, so that there's no political point scoring across this chamber? Because at the heart of this issue is how the public perceive information was held from them. And if we can stop that, we can do a review into the rioting to make sure there are no further riots, because there weren't riots in October when this information came out. So there's a discrepancy there that needs looking at, and I'd be grateful if she'd take that up.
Home Secretary.
Well, I would sort of point out to him that the violent disorders stopped when people realised they would face consequences for it, and when there was a clear police and criminal justice system response, because there is no excuse for throwing rocks and bricks at the police. There is no excuse for throwing rocks and bricks at the very same police officers who had to deal with the most horrendous attack on those little children in Southport in the first place. And I think it's really important that this inquiry and this focus now needs to be on getting those children the answers, getting the answers for the families, for those children, the answers that they need about what went wrong in this terrible case, and not trying to somehow excuse a bunch of thugs who were throwing rocks and bricks at the police, for whom, frankly, there is no excuse at all.
Jim Allister.
As we reflect on the horror of the murder of these three young girls, we all and the public have many questions. Will the terms of reference of the inquiry permit an answer to this question? How far did the inaction by the various agencies, how far was it influenced by fear of disturbing racial or community relations? Was that a factor in the inaction? And in terms of the inaction, we heard there were 3 ineffective referrals in this case to prevent. We've also heard of 162 other referrals to prevent. Have those referrals since been reviewed as to the adequacy of how they were dealt with?
Home Secretary.
Well, specifically on that point, the reason I have introduced the new Prevent Commissioner, and Sir David Anderson, Lord David Anderson, is now beginning that work as the Interim Commissioner starting right now, is because there is currently no independent review of Prevent decisions, of Prevent processes. Now, I think that's a problem because the decisions that Prevent takes are incredibly important. They need to be effective. We need to make sure that standards are maintained, and that's why we need to make sure there's an independent review. We have independent inspectors in other aspects, for example, of policing or other aspects of the work that public services do, but we need the independent commissioner to be brought in. So that allows him to be able to review not just this case, but also similar cases as well. And in terms of the scope of the inquiry, the Prime Minister has already made clear this morning, this inquiry will follow the evidence wheresoever it takes the inquiry, and no stone must go unturned.
Ben Obsey-Jecty.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On what dates were the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary made aware that Axel Rudakabana was in possession of ricin and an Al-Qaeda training manual? And will the inquiry cover public communications after the murders?
Well, ministers were, of course, updated throughout, and the Home Office was advised about ricin in August, and we were advised about the document much later on in October, and we made sure that the official opposition were also briefed. But in the end, those decisions and investigations are matters for the police on an operational basis. That is the tradition that we have in this country, where we have operational independence for policing, and why we also have the operationally independent decisions made by the CPS. And I actually think it is really sad that so many members opposite have chosen to simply ask questions about the timing of information when they know that this is governed by the Contempt of Court Act, and when they know this is about providing justice for families who lost their loved ones, rather than asking the serious questions about why that terrible and horrific and barbaric act took place. And I would really just ask him and other members who've decided which issues they want to focus on, they need to consider very seriously what they think is the most important issue here, when so many lives were lost.
Rupert Lowe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In her statement, the Home Secretary says, "Let there be no doubt, responsibility for this outrage lies squarely with the perpetrator." That's indubitably true, but I would argue there's blood on the hands of this myriad of very difficult to understand government agencies and quangos who charge around in ever-decreasing circles and blame everybody else when something goes wrong. So on that basis, will the Home Secretary commit to reviewing every single dropped or downgraded case where Prevent failed to act appropriately in order to avoid another heartbreaking catastrophe like this one?
Well, there are two things that are important that we have announced today. The first is the inquiry itself, which needs to go to the heart of what went wrong in this case, why so many agencies knew about this incredibly dangerous perpetrator who committed this barbaric act, but also to establish the new Prevent Independent Commissioner who can review cases, who can look at the different cases and the approach that's being taken to make sure that the right approach is being taken, to make sure that risks are being taken, risks are being identified, and frankly make sure action is being taken, because some of the information that I see that disturbs me, particularly some of the issues around the knife crime identified in this case, is strong enough action was not taken, and we need to make sure that it is, to keep people safe.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary very much for her statement, for her tone, and also for her well-chosen words. I don't think there's any of us in this chamber, Madam Deputy Speaker, that our hearts don't ache for the families and their loss. The trust of the local communities and the information that was released was damaged, and a lesson on transparency, I believe, must be learned. So can the Home Secretary outline how government will ensure that trust is rebuilt in this system, and that misinformation can be corrected, and that those corrections are trusted in the future to come? Thank you so much.
Home Secretary.
The honourable member is right to raise the issue around trust, because we have an important issue around the police and criminal justice system are rightly independent of government and of politics, but there needs to be trust in the work that they do. It's why this government's made it part of our mission to restore confidence in policing, for example, which had been, I think, undermined for far too long, and to stand up for the rule of law and the role that the different parts of the justice system rightly play, which are different and which need to be defended, otherwise they will not provide justice for people in the future. And crucially, in order to ensure that there is trust, we need to get to the truth about what happened in this truly shocking, terrible case, what went wrong, and why a dangerous man was able to do this, able to commit this terrible crime. Above all, for all of us, should be to keep in our minds and in our hearts 3 little children and their families and all those who've been affected by this truly appalling attack. Make sure we get them the truth and answers, and also make sure that we can do everything we can to prevent such terrible crimes.
Can I thank the Home Secretary for her statement and ask that members who are planning to leave the chamber do so quickly and quietly.